Okay, we are ready to begin. We have concluded going through the davening in progression, and now we're going to be touching on specific additional laws that come up in the context of the davening. So we'll start with rain. So let's just go back and see. We're almost finished the section of davening. We've gone through all the sections of the prayers up until the laws of the Amidah. And now we're going to speak about, in section number 19, insertions into the Amidah, rain, Rosh Chodesh, and fasts. So things that can be added to the davening. So here we go. So we're going to start off by talking about it in the beginning of the third, in the middle of the third blessing, or the middle of the second blessing of the davening. There's a place where we can insert a request, not a request for rain, but a praise of rain, thanking Hashem for giving us the rain. So if you have a siddur in front of you, you'll see just in the middle of the second blessing, we have a clause, Mashiv Haruach Amoyed HaGeshem, that he makes the wind blow and he makes the rain come down. The winds blow and the rains come down. So this is something that we don't say all year round. We only say it in the rain season. We'll discuss soon how do we define the rain season. Now, this shouldn't be confused with the second mention of rain, which is right in the middle of the Amidah, when we asking after the blessing of asking Hashem for health, that those that are sick should be healed. And the very next blessing, when we ask Hashem for good produce, there we actually ask for rain. So there is mentioning rain and there is asking for rain. And we will see that a distinction is drawn between the two. So we're going to start by speaking about the request for rain. So he says like this. During the winter, now he's talking about in the northern hemisphere, so it's in Israel. So we add Mashiv Haruach, which means may he make the wind blow, or Moed HaGeshem, and the rain to fall, in the second bracha of the Shmoneh Esrei, of the Amidah. Now, when does this begin? On what date? So this begins on Musaf prayer of Shmini Atzeres, the second to the last day of Sukkot. Well, it's actually the last day of Sukkot, but the day before Simchas Torah. Either way, the 8th day from the first day of Sukkot, with the beginning of the Musaf prayer, we begin to mention the fact that Hashem blows the wind and gives us rain. What's the connection between blowing wind and bringing us rain? Anybody? Nobody? So very simply, when it rains, it gets very wet. And when it's very wet, we need the winds to blow to dry things up so that we can actually commute. So in the rain season, we don't just mention the fact that Hashem is Moed HaGeshem, he gives us rain, but we also mention how he is Mashiv Haruach, he blows wind, because we need those winds in order to dry up the ground so that the rain doesn't get in our way. And when do we start asking for that? On Shmini Atzeres, towards the end of Sukkot. When exactly? Before the Musaf prayer on the day of Shmini Atzeres. You'll find that in your calendar. So the Shamash announces before Musaf, he bangs on the table and he says, Mashiv Haruach Amoed HaGeshem. He gives everybody a reminder. We are about to start saying Mashiv Haruach Amoed HaGeshem. If he did not make this announcement, then we actually won't say it, because everybody wants to do things together. We don't want one person doing one thing, another person doing another thing. So we need an official notification that it's time to change over. So by him making that announcement, we know that it's time to change. If he didn't make that announcement, then we won't yet make that change. We'll only make it after hearing the Chazan making the change, when he davens the Amidah aloud in the repetition. Okay. An ill person who davens at home.
For you.
Yes.
I've got a question on that. You said because they're in the northern hemisphere. So because we're in the southern hemisphere, we're still going according to their weather calendar. Is that correct? We don't change it because we're in a different season.
So this is actually a huge discussion amongst the authorities, the halachic authorities. We'll see soon that we actually don't follow Israel exactly. We actually follow Bavel, which is Mesopotamia, Iraq, Iran. We'll see that there are actually two different times when we start asking for rain. We all start mentioning rain at the same time, but we start asking for rain at different times. In Israel, they start asking for rain earlier. In Babel, they start asking for rain later. Now, why in Israel do they start asking for rain earlier? I mean, this really relates to a little bit further down the class, but hopefully we'll get there. It's because Israel has a lot of mountaintops, and since they're on mountains, they need more rain, and therefore they begin to ask for rain earlier. As opposed to Bavel, Iraq, Iran have a lot more valleys and less hills, and so therefore there's more irrigation, and therefore they're able to manage getting rain at a later stage. Quite fascinating. This is the discussion. And based on that, the question becomes, well, so then why should we follow Bavel, Iraq, Iran? Why shouldn't we follow Israel? But we're following Bavel, but if we follow Bavel, then why don't we just go by our own locale? The bottom line is, it seems that when we mention our focus is on Israel. I actually don't have that answer exactly clear, but the bottom line is that we're praying both for ourselves and for Israel, but our focus is on Israel, and therefore we follow the seasons of Israel, to keep it simple. I don't have it clear myself, so I'll have to get more on that.
The thing is, why? Because in the Gauteng, our rain is coming opposite to Israel, meaning that we get our rain after we start saying this. Our rain comes here as well as it comes in Israel.
Correct. We get it in the summertime.
But in Cape Town, it's the other way around. Correct. Cape Town has that dry period, and they have their rain at a different time.
Yeah. So it's a huge topic, and I can't really do justice to it, but I'll just say the bottom line is that we
follow Israel.
Much, in this regard, we completely follow Israel, that everyone around the world, all Jews around the world, from the beginning of what's leading up to the rain season, which is Sukkot time, everybody starts mentioning rain. We don't yet start asking for rain. Soon we'll discuss when we start asking for rain, because remember, I said in the second blessing at the beginning, that's when we mention that Hashem gives us rain, and only later, and this is only said on weekdays, after the blessing for healing. When we ask Hashem for sustenance, for produce, that's when we ask for rain. So there's mentioning rain and there's asking for rain. And we're starting by discussing mentioning rain, and everybody around the world starts to mention rain at the same time.
Yeah.
He says an ill person who davens at home, or villagers who have no minyan, should wait with their musaf prayers until the hour of which it is certain that the city synagogues have completed musaf prayers, and then they too can pray musaf and say Masha Baruch Amar Geshem. So if you're davening alone and you're not at shul, then you find out what time in shul they will be davening the musaf prayer, and then you'll know that announcement has been made, and that way it could be universal, that everybody is starting to mention rain at the same time. This is obviously relevant this past Pesach, when there were no minyanim. There was only one minyan at the time in Sandrium Gardens. So the base that gave information of exactly when that minyan would be davening and at what point everybody else should daven, so that they'll be davening in sync. They were all asking for the same thing or mentioning the same thing at the same time. Okay. And then they too can pray Musaf and say Masha Baruch Amar Geshem. Masha Baruch is said, now, so that's when we start saying it. We start saying it at the end of Sukkot. When do we end mentioning rain? So it said up until Musaf of the first day of Pesach. The congregation, as well as the Chazdal, still say it during the silent prayer. Now, this is very interesting. When it came to starting to say it, so he said that the Shabash bangs, claps on the table, and he says, Masha Baruch. He reminds everyone to say Masha Baruch. Why doesn't he do the same thing when we finish saying it before the silent Amidah? Here, we don't stop saying it in the silent Amidah. We only stop saying it after hearing the Chazan not say it. So the reason is because you don't want to make an announcement in the negative. Stop saying this. So if it's in the positive, it's saying we will now be talking about Hashem's blessing of rain, then we make an announcement. But if it's talking about no longer speaking about the bracha of rain, because actually in the wrong season, it's more like a curse than a blessing, so then we don't make such an announcement. Rather, we just wait till we hear the Chazan emitting it. And once we hear the Chazan emitting it, we know it's time for us to emit it as well. However, in some communities, I'll say in a moment, they don't say either Masha Baruch Amar Geshem or nothing. They don't say, it isn't a choice between either mentioning rain or not mentioning anything. In some communities, they either mention rain or they mention dew. In those communities, already before the silent Amidah, they would make the change because you would be able to make an announcement. Marid Hatol. We're now going to start mentioning dew instead of rain. Okay, this is perhaps you could say a little bit on the technical side, exactly when we start and stop, but this is the opportunity to have an understanding of how things work and somewhat why they work the way they do. So as we were talking about the last time to mention rain, when the Chazan repeats the Musaf prayer, then he discontinues saying it. And after that, the congregation does not say it at the Mincha prayer because they've heard him admitting it, so they know that it's time to stop. Person davening privately should say the Musaf prayer early enough to be before the Chazan says it, so that again, he will be saying things together with the whole community, that everybody will be doing the same thing. The rabbis don't want to make a distinction between one person and the next. Okay, then he says the next point that I just said, that in some communities, instead of saying not mentioning rain, they speak about the bracha of dew. And in that case, they would actually be able to have an announcement before the silent Amidah and switch over then. So in summary, we start mentioning Hashem's blessing of rain at the end of Sukkot, before the silent Amidah of Musaf. That's when we start mentioning rain, and we start mentioning it after we hear the Chazan admitting it on the first day of Pesach, or after an announcement is made to switch over to dew. Okay. Now, what happens if you made a mistake, if you got it wrong? Now, you might say, what's the big deal? But it is a big deal because our prayers are not, God forbid, futile. They're not just haphazard. They're not just whatever. It's all good. Every word that we say has an impact. Otherwise, we wouldn't be saying it. If it didn't have its impact, then why would we say it all together? We'd be wasting our time. The reason we daven is because we believe it makes a difference, which means that if we say the wrong word at the wrong time, then we are making a negative difference. We're pushing things out of sync, and therefore that needs to be corrected. So what exactly needs to be corrected? So he says, if you did not mention that Hashem is Bashav Aroch Amarid HaGeshem, that Hashem blows the winds and gives us rain, if you remembered it before you completed the blessing, then you could immediately correct yourself and add it in. So this is very relevant because at that switch, when we switch from saying it to not saying it, or from not saying it to saying it, it takes a bit of time until people get used to it. So it could happen often a time that somebody accidentally gets messed up. So the question is, what needs to be done? So he says, if you remember while you're still there in the right place, then you could correct it. So you could add it in wherever you are, as long as you're not in the middle of a phrase. For instance, if you remembered after you said, the fulfiller of his faithfulness, just finish that sentence and say, the Shene offer to those who sleep in the dust, meaning that we have confidence that Hashem will revive the dead. And then you would say, Vashiv Aruach. So the point is that if you forgot to say that clause, as long as you're still in the same blessing, add it in between sentences. If you prefer, you may repeat the whole paragraph, that is Vashiv Aruach Amarid HaGeshem, and then continue with Machal Kol Chayim. But, so if you're not so familiar with the morning prayers, you might find this a little bit over your head. But stay with us and just take the general points that you are familiar with. But if you did not remember, realize that you had forgotten to mention the blessing of rain until after you completed the whole blessing of B'chaya HaBeisim, then you'd have to repeat the Amidah. Because as we said, every word is precise. And if it's it's the beginning of the rain season, and we don't mention the bracha of rain, then our Amidah was not in sync. And therefore, you would have to repeat it. Okay. Now you can't go back a little bit because the first three blessings are all considered like one long blessing. And so you can't go back to the middle because you got to go back to the beginning of the blessing. And the beginning of the blessing is the beginning of the Amidah because this is all within the first three blessings. Okay. Now, if this happened during the Ma'ariv service of Pesach, or during the Shachar service, or during Musaf, then you need not return. So to explain this in just a few words, really from the beginning of Pesach, that's the end of the rain season, and that's when we'd start mentioning rain. However, we said we want everybody to be in sync. Now, since not everybody makes it to shul at night, and some people may live at the end of town and it may be dangerous for them to travel, so not everybody would get to shul at night, as opposed to the morning when most people would get to shul. So the rabbis didn't want to make that turnover, that change, until a time when everybody was there. So in theory, we would already make that change on the very first night of Pesach, which in Johannesburg is perhaps the fourth most packed night of the year. But since many have difficulty traveling at night, so the rabbi said, wait until the following day, and then when everybody is in shul, that's when we'll make the changeover. Now, since in theory we would have already switched over at night, if a person accidentally made that change already the night before, since there is already an appropriate time to make the change, then he would not need to repeat the Amidah. Okay. Here he mentions what I mentioned earlier, that some congregations, instead of either mentioning rain or mentioning nothing, they instead mention the bracha of dew in the summertime. They say Omerit Hatol. This is, for example, in the Chabad Siddur. If you erred and said it also during the winter, or if you do not remember that you should have said Moed HaGeshem until after you said Baruch Atah Hashem, you should complete the bracha B'chai HaMeisim, and you are not required to repeat the Amidah. Although you didn't mention rain, since you did mention dew, you've mentioned some form of bracha, and so therefore the Amidah does not need to be repeated. Although if you're still in the middle of the blessing, then you should correct it. You should add it in. Number 4. Again, this might be a little bit hard to keep track of, but we're maybe going a little bit of a faster pace because I'd rather not skip it out. It's important. It's just more on the technical side. So I hope you can keep track. So now comes the reverse. It's the summer season, which is not the season for rain in Israel, and you accidentally mentioned rain. So the Shulchan Aruch actually says that rain in the wrong season is not a blessing, it's a curse. And so therefore that certainly would have to be corrected. So here we go. If you erred during the summer, and said, again, it means the summer in Israel, and said Vashem Baruch Moed HaGeshem, meaning you mentioned the rain, if you realize before you finish the bracha, then you should go back and repeat that blessing, skipping out the mention of rain. Meaning, because once you've said something, how are you going to take it back? The only way you'll take back what you already said is if you repeat the whole clause and leaving it out. If you just otherwise, if you didn't say something you're supposed to say, you could just add it in. But if you said something you weren't meant to say, then you'll need to go back and redo it without leaving out what shouldn't have been mentioned. And since we said that rain in the summer in Israel is not a blessing, it's a curse, you would, if you still remembered while you were still in the midst of the blessing, then you would redo it and correct it by leaving out that mention of rain, since this is not a time for rain. However, if you didn't realize until you finished the blessing, then you'd have to repeat the Amidah, because again, we said those first 3 blessings are units. So once you've forgotten, then you'd have to go back to the beginning. Okay. If you said Mashiv HaRuach, and you didn't yet say Moed HaGeshem, so you said let the winds blow, but you didn't say let the rains come down, then that's fine. Because the curse is not the winds, it's the rain. What's damaging is when it rains in the wrong season, not when the winds blow in the wrong season. If you earn it Ma'ariv on Shachas of Shmini Atzeres and out of Hashem Baruch, you need not go back to the beginning, just like we said before, that rarely the time would have been from the night, but we wait till the next day till everyone's in shul. So the same thing goes as far as when we start mentioning rain. So usually we wait till the daytime. If somebody already mentioned rain the night before, then it's not considered a curse because it already is the time of rain. And therefore he would not need to repeat the Amidah. So this was all as far as mentioning rain in the second blessing of the Amidah. The next 2, 3 halachas, or 4 halachas, or 5 I should say. The next 5 we'll deal with in the middle of the Amidah when we ask for rain. So right now we spoke about mentioning rain. The next 5 laws we'll speak about when we ask for rain. And then the final laws will speak about special additions that are made to the Amidah on Rosh Chodesh and other special occasions. And that will take us to the end of the chapter. Thank you for joining us and wishing you a wonderful week.
You too. Toda Rabba, Rabbi.